everyone, and welcome back to Plainest Pages. Today we're talking about the poem From the Journal of a Disappointed Man by Andrew Notion. As usual, let's first make a summary and then move on to the stanza by stanza analysis. A quick note on Andrew Notion. He grew up in the English countryside, and so a lot of his poems center around that topic, and he was heavily impacted by the loss of his mother early on in his life. He was tutored by W.H. Auden and Philip Larkin, and his poems are emotion and silently powerful. From the Journal of a Disappointed Man talks about the working class men who are trying to drive a pile into the pier. The speaker observes them and remarks how masculine they are in the traditional sense, but eventually the men give up because they realize that their efforts to drive the pile are futile and they simply leave. The poem focuses on the relationship between the men, and it links in themes of gender, masculinity, social class, and society. The poem's title alerts the reader to the poem being a journal, which is evidenced by the more personal feel. It also shows us that the emotion is more raw and honest, rather than something that has been carefully edited, and as such the structure of the poem is much more fluid. It almost feels like someone wrote this, and the spaces were added for effect. It doesn't have a rigid rhyme scheme or meter. It's sort of like watered down stream of consciousness in that the speaker just blurts everything they see onto the paper, but they do not completely observe every small and random thing. However, the personal element that puts us in the narrator's situation is juxtaposed with the anonymity of the word man. The word man encompasses all of humanity, suggesting that this is a universal experience. We address the mundane issue and most simultaneously address the universal existentialist question of what is our purpose here? There is, however, a consistent layout of 4-line stanzas showing the rigid masculinity and assertive strength that comes with the narrator's voice. The enjambment and the lines usually carrying on makes the poem more like a story, but this also makes everything sound much more simple. Rather than an elaborate poem, we have a simple story split into stanzas, which is representative of the working class simplicity that the speaker is showing us. I discovered these men driving a new pile into the pier. There was all the paraphernalia of chains, pulleys, cranes, ropes, and, as I said, a wooden pile, a massive affair swinging. The use of the word discovered shows that he has found the men, and likewise, not only has he found men that are different from him, that are more masculine, that are different in their very sense of existence, he has also found an alternative path in life. Because the narrator is quite well educated, well, clearly, because he uses more sophisticated polysyllabic vocabulary like paraphernalia or a massive affair, unlike the monosyllabism of the working class men, which we will see later on. So they drive a new pile into the pier while the speaker observes. So in case you don't know, a pile is like a wooden basically support that props up a pier. So piers are these bridges out into the ocean, these bridges out into open air, and they were very popular during the Victorian and Edwardian times, and they were seen as like a health method. So you go out and you breathe the salty fresh air, but they were also seen as a symbol of progress. The fact that we as humanity have come so far that we may just casually walk and promenade into the ocean. The piers still exist today in a lot of the beachside cities in England, and the fact that the piers are rotting away because of the salt water are a symbol of the decaying social order and a symbol of time passing. So the fact that the working class men, are there propping up the things that high Victorian society enjoyed is, I think, a metaphor for the way that the working classes prop up our society now. All of our society is structured on their labor. We depend on their labor, and yet they are the most underappreciated out of all the classes. And the word paraphernalia here, it's also referencing the disparity in education, how there can be different forms of education, but not every form of education is equally valid. So like equally valued or considered equally valid. For example, like paraphernalia is typically used when referencing elite Ivy League universities. Harvard has their own like little flags. Oxford has their hoodies. People wear those hoodies. People wear NASA hoodies, even if they do not go to these places, because they want to be seen as having that status of belonging, that status of elite education. Whereas for the working men, the paraphernalia is the chains, pulleys, cranes, ropes. Also notice the plosive P sounds, which again highlight the strengths required from these men. They have a different kind of education, and ironically, it's the well-educated speaker who doesn't understand anything. He doesn't know how to help these men. He's not used to this heavy machinery or these piles or these piers. For him, this is as novel as it is mundane for them, and it shows that that kind of education is also equally valid. For him, this is a secret, a strange, mysterious affair. The wooden pile is a massive affair. So the use of these words like "as I said" or "I discovered" or like "strange, mysterious," the use of the personal pronoun "I" in all of these phrases, this reminds us that this is in fact a journal. And so the pile swings over the water on a long wire hawser. Everything else was in the massive style as well. Even the men, very powerful men, very ruminative and silent men, ignoring me. So a hawser is a piece of equipment. It's sort of like a massive rope, but out of wire. And I had to Google that because, again, the narrator reminds us that we, as the audience, our education is not enough. So we can assume that for this poem, the main audience would actually be like middle class and like upper class people, simply because of the education that we have, and also because, well, typically working class people are more concerned with survival. And so the narrator highlights that by using this vocabulary that's strange for us. For most of us, we're not going to know what it is. And again, he sets up this circle of us and them. So we are the upper classes, they are the working classes. He highlights the difference in our knowledge, he highlights the difference in our education, not only through the language that we use, but also through the kind of labor that we do, through seeing how paraphernalia and education is different for these men and how it's different for us. He reminds us that he doesn't belong with these working class men, which is why this poem feels more like an observation. It feels like an outsider. The men are portrayed as almost these godlike figures, these idealized, perfect versions, these archetypes of masculinity. They're the men satisfied with their physical work. They're silently great. They're somehow about the above the petty affairs of the upper class men. The men are massive, powerful, ruminative, silent, ruminative. They are thoughtful. They have their own higher purpose. They are much better than these upper class, dainty, white collar men who cannot get their hands dirty. They're massive, much like the pile. They are the stoic machinery supporting us and supporting humanity. The narrator seems very much at contrast to them with his own appearance. Even though it is not explicitly stated, we can assume that he's that white collar man who seems so different from these people. It is only at the end do his expectations of their greatness fall apart. His prejudices are challenged, and he realizes that although he idealizes them as these ideal men, even if he's the only one in society who sees them as these ideal men, they are ultimately just as lost in this world as we are. Humanity is all collectively united by our lack of purpose, by our lack of knowledge about what our purpose is, about what the meaning of life is. Speech was not something to interest them, and if they talked at all, it was like this: let go, or hold tight, all monosyllables. Nevertheless, by paying close attention to the obscure movements of one working on a ladder by the water's edge, I could tell that for all their strength and experience, these men were up against a great difficulty. Speech does not interest them. They are entirely focused on the task of mending the pier. The pier is a remnant of the past time, of better times to come, of hope that the future can be there. But they can't seem to fix the problem. They're up against a great difficulty. No one knows what to do. The men's strength, the men's knowledge is not enough. They are facing a different social order, and this represents how so many people in our society feel lost and feel confused now, because things are not like they were in the past. For the educated narrator who recognizes this symbolism, it also doesn't help him that he's aware of this, because he can ultimately not help them either. It's the ultimate metaphor where poking a pile under the pier without being able to see under the pier. So essentially what they're doing is they're just blindly trying to fix the past, or go back to a version of the past, or prop up the social order that has existed for millennia. And now they are unsure of what to do. And it's unsure whether the pier was really perfect in the first place, or whether we just romanticized the past and pretended that it was perfect. And likewise, we idealize these men and we assign them the stereotype of, oh, working class men, they're so great, they're so above these like petty concerns because they're focused on survival. And yet no one wants to be like these working class men. Everybody wants to be the ideal, the muscly person, the one who's like stoic and silent, the true man. But nobody wants to live in terrible working conditions. Everybody wants to get paid more. Everybody wants to be as upper class as they can get. Just like we're blindly supporting the peer, likewise we are blindly idealizing these men, not even aware fully of the problems that they are facing. The poem is titled From the Journal of a Disappointed Man, and the tone and atmosphere reflect that. The narrator doesn't feel like he can help them solve the problem, and this also shows how isolated he is and how isolated humanity has become from each other, much more individualistic. The men are forcing themselves to work, and likewise the poem feels forced too, almost as if it was prose and someone randomly split it into parts and made it into a poem. The lines are randomly enjambed and fluctuations in observations. There's no structure. It is only human-made, much like the disorder society forces itself into. So if one forces oneself to do what they don't want to in life, they will also be like their peer, crumbling on the inside, and no one is able to fix it. Though the poem claims to be a journal entry, it's not quite there either. It offers very little insight into the narrator's feelings. Much of what we know we have inferred. So there's a constant element of uncertainty and the imposter syndrome. We can link it back to the poet's biography. Andrew Motion grew up in the countryside, and only later did he become poet laureate, so perhaps he couldn't shake the feeling of not belonging, going from the rural area straight into the spotlight. I cannot say what. Every one of the monsters was silent on the subject. Baffled, I thought at first, but then I realized indifferent and tired of the whole business. The narrator cannot say what the issue is. He outwardly states it here. And language is very forward, and when the speaker says something directly, it's often about the men. So he'll say the men are massive directly, and they're baffled, but no, they're actually not baffled at all. They're indifferent and tired of the whole business. So this could be a criticism of the manner of speech of the upper class, who tend to speak in like metaphors and these elaborate phrases when they can't really commit to anything. We're like, oh yeah, sure, we'll think about it, and think about it as not a concrete promise. It's very ambiguous and airy, whereas the language of the monsters, the working class men, is much more admirably forward. They say, hold this, do this, they say it directly. The use of the word monsters as well, it dehumanizes them. It also enforces that stereotype of like, oh, working class are primitive because they don't have a proper education. But the fact that the men do not care anymore, the fact that at the end they stopped attempting to repair the peer, shows that they are past that stage where they care enough about the upper class to, frankly, to let it affect them. They do not care if they are monsters anymore, if they're considered stupid. They realize the pointlessness of it all and they leave. That's why they do not enlighten the narrator. That's why they do not play into what society expects of them. The man nearest to me, still saying nothing but crossing his strong arms over his chest, showed me that for all he cared, the pile could go on swinging until the crack of doom. The man uses his body language to indicate his feelings. He doesn't use his voice, because again, that image of the traditional man, the man who's so stoic, who doesn't show his emotion because oh, emotions are for women, that kind of guy. He crosses his arm. It's a protective gesture, but it's also a dismissive one. The pile can go on swinging for all he cares. And this expression, like swinging until the crack of doom, it's a very popular colloquial phrase meaning like, oh, who cares? Well, certainly not me. And the crack of doom is a reference to doomsday, so he doesn't care now and he won't care until the end of time. It doesn't scare him in the least. And instead he just stands there and he watches it, and he's past the point where he was concerned about what the employer would say or what people would think. Again, he realizes that it doesn't really matter. The poem moves towards a tone of dismissiveness, towards a tone of meaninglessness. And I think it would be interesting to compare this to Simon Armitage's Chainsaw versus the Pampas Grass, and to compare the ways that stereotypical working class men are presented, because in the Chainsaw poem, the chainsaw is like the drinking man, also the violent man, whereas here, these are the men that are the epitome of strength, much like in that poem, but they are not violent, they are thoughtful, they are composed, they are much more admired. And doom is capitalized here because that is what matters most for the working class men. We have typically considered them, we have those stereotypes of associations where we think that working class people are unable to enjoy delayed gratification. So that's why they're poor, that's what people say. At least they say, oh, the reason that they're poor is because they cannot save, they do not have self-control, they do not understand. And here that man conforms to this idea by saying, screw the consequences and the doom. He's doomed if he doesn't do it now, so it's just another job. He chooses not to do it, and he chooses to stop caring. I should say I watched them for at least an hour, and to do the men justice, their slow efforts to overcome the secret problem did continue, then gradually slackened and finally ceased. One massive man after another abandoned his position and leaned on the iron rail to gaze down like a mystic into the water. No one spoke, no one said what they saw, though one fellow did spit, and with round eyes followed the trajectory of his brown bolus he had been chewing tobacco on its slow descent into the same depth. They tried, but their efforts were not enough. The load was too heavy to bear. So they leave their positions and they stare into the water and they abandon their position like a mystic. So the speaker doesn't know what the man is thinking, but he's very prophet-like. And again, he realizes the pointlessness of it all. And that listless feeling is, I'm sure, familiar to many of you who have ever felt not in their zone or who just want to dissociate and zone out and just think like, what am I doing? Why am I here? Why do I exist? You stare mesmerized at nature and think back, I wish things were simpler. The foreman and the most original thinker smoked a cigarette to relieve the tension. Afterwards, and with a heavy kind of majesty, he turned on his heels and walked away. With this eclipse of interest, the incident was suddenly closed, first in ones and twos, then all together. The men followed, but left the pile still in mid-air. And me, of course. The leader, the thinker, who's been leading the progress and urging the men forward. First he smokes, pondering his decision, and then, with a heavy kind of majesty, he walks away. So he leaves like a royal. He dismisses his subject. He shows that there's another kind of social hierarchy within the working class. They have their own people who they respect. They don't respect the boss or the upper class who assign them with these menial tasks. They respect the people who actually command their respect, people who know how to be leaders, who deserve their position, people who know how to handle a pile, or people who can say that, guys, this is pointless. Now the incident is suddenly closed and no one sees it as anything more than an incident. It's in the past. They move on, leaving the pier to the past and leaving it to decay, essentially. First, just some men leave and then the group does. Much like humanity embracing social change, it starts just a little bit at first and then it snowballs on. But they leave the pile dangling, and the narrator, uncertain where to go, uncertain whether to follow the men or leave them, because he's not quite a part of this experience. He was just an observer, nothing more. By the end, it seems that neither kind of man, the worker nor the educated narrator, has an answer to the secret problem. The Soviet-era heroism fades away in the face of hopelessness and purposelessness. All are spare parts, all are simply, well, dangling, because we are all uncertain of our purpose, all unsure of what to do, all lost in our existence in life, listlessness and uncertainty. That's what we're left with. The poem is a very existentialist one, far more complex than we would have thought at the beginning. It's much more than just about workers fixing a pier. It's about the past crumbling away. It's about being unable to fix society. It's about being unable to improve our lives without quite knowing what's the underlying issue at hand. This poem is for the people who have been lost and who don't quite know what to do with their lives. This poem is for the people who know what to do with their lives, but don't quite know what's the point of what they want to do. And yet, even with all this uniting characteristic of being lost, we still continue to divide ourselves under superficial characteristics like who has more money or who looks a certain way. And the result is that we're unable to communicate and we're all unable to simply put our heads together and solve the problem. And that's what leaves the pier without a pile. That's what leaves society without the boards. Our lack of communication, our lack of empathy, and our lack of making the first step towards each other. This is what the poem means to me, and I think it's significant that the pile has been left, well, unattended. It's been dangling, it's been left behind. It's like a solution that's just within reach if we only work together. And under the pier, it's supporting society, but there's no longer such a distinct and clear structure to support anymore. We ourselves have ensured that there's no clear structure by continuously dividing ourselves and asserting our individuality. There's nothing bad about asserting our individuality, but there is if it comes at the cost of making these human connections. And so for today, I'd like to leave you with that thought. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this study guide for the Edexcel A Level English Literature curriculum, and I hope you will stick around for more such study guides. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.